Clint Eastwood saves woman abused by mob. The aftermath is heartwarming. The alley was dark, with only the faintest light bleeding through the cracks in the old brick walls. The rain had begun to fall harder, soaking the streets and creating a damp, sticky layer over the grime that had accumulated in the cracks of the pavement. It was the perfect setting for something sinister, and tonight that sinister thing was happening. The woman, hunched over and exhausted, stumbled through the alley. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Her hair clung to her face, matted and dirty. She was trembling, not just from the cold, but from fear. Fear of the men who had been following her for hours, terrorizing her with every step. They had been after her, hunting her down like prey, and now they had her cornered. "Where you think you're going?" A voice sneered from the shadows. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure step forward. A man in a dark suit, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of other men slowly emerged, surrounding her, closing in like wolves circling their kill. She could feel the suffocating weight of their presence. One of the men, taller than the others, stepped forward. His voice was calm, controlled, but it held a cruel edge. "You've got nowhere to run now, sweetheart." She backed up, eyes wide in panic, but her escape was blocked by the dirty brick wall behind her. There was nowhere to go, no way out. "What do you want?" she gasped, barely able to get the words out. The pain in her chest from the blows she had taken earlier made it hard to breathe. "Shut up," the tall man hissed, grabbing her by the hair and yanking her head back, exposing her throat. "You don't get to talk. Not after what you did." Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She had been trying to escape them, trying to get away. But they had found her, and now there was no one left to help. "Please," she whimpered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Please, just leave me alone." Another man, shorter but stockier, stepped forward. He laughed, a low, sickening sound. "Leave you alone? You really think we're just going to let you go after what you did?" He shook his head, his face twisted into a cruel smirk. "No, you're ours now." With that, the men closed in. They grabbed at her, tearing her clothing, ripping the remnants of her dignity away as they laughed and jeered. She struggled, but they overpowered her easily, their hands pinning her to the wall, their voices rising in a chorus of mockery. "Should have known better than to fight back," one of them sneered. Tears of frustration and fear blurred her vision as she tried to pull herself free. But the more she fought, the tighter their grip became. The pain was too much, and her body began to tremble, no longer from the cold but from the overwhelming hopelessness of the situation. In the back of her mind, a thought lingered, faint, distant, but still there. Was this how it was going to end? She didn't want to believe it, but as they laughed and tore at her, their hands growing rougher and more aggressive, it became harder to deny. The world had closed in around her, and she had no way out. One of the men, short and wiry with dark eyes that gleamed with malice, smirked as he stepped forward. His hands were rough as he pulled her hair back, exposing her neck to the others. "You should have known your place," he sneered. "Now you'll pay." Just as the words left his mouth, the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. Slow and measured, each step deliberate. The men paused, turning their heads as if sensing something shifting in the air. The woman's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't see who was coming, but she felt it. An odd, undeniable shift. There was something different about the air around her. The mobsters, too, seemed to realize something was about to happen. Before anyone could react, a voice, low and steady, spoke from the darkness. "That's far enough." The men froze, turning toward the voice. There was a shift in the atmosphere, like the air itself had been sucked out of the alley. Clint Eastwood. His figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention. He was dressed in a long coat, the hem brushing against the soaked pavement. His face was hard, weathered, an expression of a man who had seen too much, a man who didn't hesitate when it came to righting wrongs. The mobsters were too stunned by his presence to react immediately, and for just a moment the woman thought that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment that things would change. But then the tension returned. The tall man, the leader of the group, let out a short, harsh laugh. "You think you can just waltz in here and stop us?" Clint's eyes narrowed, his hand slowly moving toward his coat. The gun tucked beneath his jacket was still there, but he didn't need to pull it just yet. His voice was calm, measured. "I don't have to think. I know." The group hesitated. They'd seen men like Clint before, the kind who didn't flinch, who didn't back down. But there were so many of them and so few of him. Surely they could overpower him just as they had with the woman. But Clint wasn't here to fight just yet. Not until the time was right. And that time was coming. Clint Eastwood's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward into the dim light, the weight of his presence heavy on the alley. His gaze swept over the group of men, all of them still frozen, unsure of what to do. His feet made no sound as he walked, and the cold rain, now falling harder, only added to the eerie silence that enveloped the alley. Every drop that hit the pavement felt like a drumbeat, a countdown to the inevitable. The mobsters didn't move. They didn't even blink. The tall man at the front, the one who had been tormenting the woman, finally broke the silence with a laugh. It was harsh, a low chuckle that seemed to mock the very air around them. Well, what do we have here?" His eyes flickered to the woman, who was still pressed against the wall, gasping for breath, too afraid to move. Then he turned his attention back to Clint. "Some old man who thinks he can walk in and stop us?" The sarcasm in his voice dripped like venom. Clint's lips barely moved as he spoke. "I don't think I know." A moment of tension passed before the man let out another laugh. It was hollow, almost as though he were trying to convince himself that Clint was no threat. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" he sneered. Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots making a soft thud on the wet ground. His eyes stayed fixed on the leader of the mob as though the man didn't even matter, as if he was already defeated in Clint's mind. The woman, though battered and barely able to stand, watched Clint through her blurred vision. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change from a place of terror to something different. Clint wasn't just standing there. He was waiting. One of the other men, not as tall but built like a rock, grunted in frustration. "You're not scaring anyone, old man. Get out of here or we'll make you." Clint didn't flinch, didn't even seem to hear the man. He kept his eyes fixed on the leader, who was now growing impatient. The mobster's hand twitched toward his side, where a gun rested, but before he could draw it, Clint moved faster than they had anticipated. In the blink of an eye, Clint closed the distance between them. His hand shot out, grabbing the mobster's wrist with the force of a vice. The man's eyes widened in shock as Clint twisted his arm behind his back with expert precision. His movement so swift it was like a blur. The mobster grunted in pain, but Clint didn't release him. "You've had your chance," Clint said, his voice as cold as the rain that soaked them both. The other men froze, watching the scene unfold. The mobster Clint had disarmed let out a string of curses, but Clint simply shoved him away. The man stumbled, falling to his knees on the wet pavement, clutching his wrist in pain. The tall leader's expression hardened, and for the first time, Clint could see the flicker of real fear behind his eyes. "What the hell is your problem, old man?" he growled. "You think you can come in here and stop us?" Clint didn't say a word. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, his hands steady at his sides. He wasn't in a rush, he didn't need to be. The mobsters may have been a group, but Clint had a way of handling things that they had clearly never encountered before. The rain was coming down harder now, blurring their vision and making the street even slicker, the puddles of water reflecting the harsh fluorescent light from the alleyway. The woman, still pressed against the wall, couldn't help but feel a shred of hope. It was faint, but it was there. She didn't know who this man was, but she could tell he wasn't like the others. The leader of the mob barked an order to the other men, his voice rising. "Get him! We're not taking this from anyone." The mobsters moved as one, rushing forward with the kind of mob mentality that only a group of desperate men could have. But Clint didn't flinch. He had seen this before. He had done this before. Before they could get close, Clint moved again, faster than any of them could react. His fist slammed into one man's gut, knocking the wind out of him. Another one tried to swing a punch, but Clint blocked it with a swift movement, twisting the man's arm behind him with a precision that made him howl in pain. The woman, watching helplessly, could barely believe what was happening. Her body was still bruised, still shaking from the torment they had put her through, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from Clint's movements. He was like a machine, each strike landing exactly where it needed to, each movement controlled, deliberate, ruthless. A couple of the men hesitated, realizing that this wasn't a fight they could win. But the leader, his eyes filled with rage, continued to bark orders, his voice rising in fury. "You think you can just waltz in here and stop us?" The leader shouted. "We own this street, old man." Clint's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "No, you don't," he said, his voice low but firm. "This street belongs to anyone who dares stand up for what's right." The words hung in the air, and the tension in the alley grew thicker. The mobsters were still uncertain of the man who had just single-handedly taken down two of their own, uncertain of the force they were up against. But the leader wasn't ready to back down yet. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun. The barrel gleamed in the dim light, and for a moment, it looked like Clint might be in trouble. But Clint didn't move, didn't flinch. He knew exactly what was coming, and he wasn't afraid. The barrel of the gun gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the dim glow like a snake's tongue. The leader of the mob gripped it tightly, his finger twitching on the trigger, his eyes locked on Clint, trying to gauge the man's next move. Clint didn't budge. His expression was unreadable, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he had faced this exact situation 1,000 times before. The mobsters behind the leader looked nervous now, their bodies shifting uncomfortably, glancing at each other as if expecting someone else to make the first move. But the leader, determined and filled with fury, wasn't about to let his grip falter. "You think you can just stand there and not get hurt?" The leader spat, his voice seething with venom. His hand trembled slightly as he leveled the gun at Clint's chest. Clint remained calm, his stance unshaken. He had been in countless confrontations like this. Threats, posturing, violence in the shadows. He knew what the mobster was trying to do. Make Clint flinch, make him doubt his resolve, make him feel fear. But Clint wasn't afraid. "Go ahead," Clint said, his voice steady but low. "Pull the trigger." The words hung in the air, an eerie calm that surrounded them both. The leader hesitated, caught off guard by Clint's unwavering confidence. For a moment, there was a shift in the air, an uncertainty. The man's hand shook just slightly, and Clint's piercing gaze didn't leave his. The sound of the rain pattering on the pavement was the only thing that filled the empty space between them. Behind Clint, the woman, who had been clinging to the wall in an almost catatonic state, blinked, her vision clouded by tears and rain, but she couldn't look away. She was frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. But she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This man, this stranger, was standing between her and these monsters, and he was ready to face them no matter what. "Don't listen to him," one of the other mobsters muttered from behind the leader. "Just pull the damn trigger. He's just one guy." But the leader wasn't listening to his lackey anymore. His eyes shifted between Clint and the trembling woman in the alley, her body still weak and broken, her face a mixture of terror and disbelief. He could see that she was no longer the same person she had been before. The fear had dulled her senses, replaced by something else. Something that Clint seemed to have drawn out of her just by standing there. "You don't know who you're dealing with?" The leader spat again, stepping forward, his gun still aimed at Clint's chest. "This isn't some street fight, old man. This is bigger than you, bigger than her. We've got connections everywhere. You don't even know who you're messing with." Clint finally spoke, his voice quiet but piercing, like a knife cutting through the night. "I don't need to know who you are. I know what you are." The words seemed to land like a slap, and the leader flinched, his grip tightening on the gun. The tension in the alley was suffocating now. It felt like the world had slowed down, the rain becoming more pronounced, the occasional rustle of trash bags swaying in the wind the only other sound. Behind him, the woman's breathing quickened, her hand gripping the wet brick wall as if trying to anchor herself to the ground. She wasn't sure whether to be terrified or relieved. The tension in the air was so thick that she felt like she might suffocate from it. But at the same time, there was something about Clint's unwavering demeanor that made her want to trust him, to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could get them out of this nightmare. The leader's hand began to shake. His mouth opened, his breath quickening, but he didn't say anything. He was trying to get the words out, trying to process what was happening, but it wasn't working. He wasn't used to being the one backed into a corner. He wasn't used to someone standing up to him, to not being the one in control. And that's when it happened. Clint stepped forward just a little, but enough to make a statement. Enough to show that he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't going anywhere. It was a subtle movement, but it was the tipping point. The mobsters behind the leader seemed to hold their breath. They knew what was coming, even if they didn't fully understand it. "You don't want to do this," Clint said, his voice still steady. "But if you think you can take me down, go ahead. I've got all night." The words weren't a threat. They were a promise. A promise that Clint had no intention of backing down. The leader's lip curled, his face twisting in frustration. For a second, there was a flicker of doubt. Then the gun was gone. With a swift movement, the leader holstered the gun. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice breaking. His anger had reached its boiling point, and in that moment, Clint saw it, the panic, the fear in the leader's eyes. This wasn't the bravado of someone who had control. This was the desperation of someone who knew they had already lost. Clint took another step closer, his boots clicking softly against the wet ground. His hand reached out, and in one fluid motion, he grabbed the leader by the collar and yanked him forward. The man's feet slid across the slick pavement as Clint slammed him against the wall. The rest of the mob hesitated, unsure of what to do, paralyzed by fear and confusion. They had been expecting a fight. They had been expecting the old man to put up some resistance. But this wasn't a fight. This was a reckoning. "You've made your mistake," Clint said calmly, his face inches from the leader's, his grip tightening with each word. "Now you'll pay for it." The other mobsters seemed to come to their senses at that moment, drawing weapons and stepping forward. But Clint was ready. He had seen men like this before. He knew how to handle them. The rain was coming down harder now, mixing with the blood that had been spilled, the damp ground making it harder to keep his balance. But Clint had the upper hand, and they all knew it. The leader, still gasping for breath, tried to push Clint away, but Clint's grip was unyielding. "Not so fast," Clint growled. "You're going to answer for what you've done." The air felt thick with menace. Each breath Clint took seeming to make the tension heavier, more suffocating. The rain had turned into a downpour, the streetlights reflecting off the slick pavement, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted with every movement. The mobsters were now fully aware that they were facing more than they had bargained for. The cold realization that they had underestimated Clint was setting in like a slow burn. The leader's face, pressed up against the wet brick wall, was a mask of anger and fear. His chest heaved as he gasped for breath, his fingers clutching the fabric of Clint's jacket like he could somehow pull himself free. But Clint wasn't giving him an inch. His grip was like iron, each breath from the leader only deepening the mobster's desperation. "You don't get to walk away from this." Clint's voice was low and steady, but there was an edge to it now, a promise of what was to come. His eyes never left the leader's face, not even for a moment, and in those eyes, the mobster saw something cold and unforgiving. A man who had been pushed too far and wasn't willing to take any more of their cruelty. "You're just a man, old man," the leader spat, his voice filled with contempt. But even as he spoke, his words faltered, realizing how weak they sounded. Clint had a presence about him, something that made every word count, made every second of silence feel like a slow countdown to something that couldn't be avoided. Clint stepped back just slightly, just enough to allow the man some space to breathe. but his hands remained firmly on his collar. He wasn't letting him go. Not yet. From the shadows, the rest of the mob watched, their eyes darting from Clint to the leader, unsure of how to proceed. It was like the whole alley had frozen, like time itself was waiting for someone to make the next move. The sound of the rain pounding the pavement filled the void, a constant reminder of how out of control the situation had become. "Let him go, man. Just let it be," one of the mobsters called out. But his voice cracked, betraying the fear that was bubbling beneath the surface. They had expected Clint to back down. They had expected the old man to cower before them. But Clint wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of them, not in the least. And that frightened them more than anything. "Shut up," the leader snapped, his voice rising again. He tried to push Clint away, but Clint's arm was like a steel beam, unmovable. "You think you're the hero here? You think this is some damn movie where you get to play the knight in shining armor?" Clint's expression didn't change. His eyes were cold, calculating, like a man who had been through too much and wasn't going to take any more. "You're no hero," Clint said, his voice cutting through the leader's defiance. "You're a bully with a gun and you think that gives you power. But you're wrong." The words landed with a finality that seemed to crack the fragile shell of bravado the leader had been clinging to. The mobster's hands dropped to his sides, his breath coming faster as he looked around at his men, his eyes betraying the panic he was trying to suppress. "You don't know who you're messing with?" the leader snarled, trying to sound confident, but it was clear he was losing control. His voice had turned shrill, desperate. Clint's grip tightened, and the mobster winced in pain. "I don't need to know who you are," Clint said, his voice growing darker. "I know what you are." The leader's eyes darted back and forth, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. His men were still frozen, their eyes filled with uncertainty, their hands twitching at their sides, unsure whether to move or stay put. One of them finally made a move. He pulled out a gun, aiming it at Clint's back. Clint heard the click of the safety coming off, but he didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The leader saw the gun pointed at Clint and his eyes widened. "Don't do it," he hissed, his voice now hoarse with panic. "I've got this. Don't make it worse." But the man with the gun didn't listen. He was already too far gone. His hand was shaking as he held the weapon, his finger trembling on the trigger. The air between them felt charged, crackling with the electricity of an impending storm. "I said, shut up," Clint growled, and in that split second, he moved faster than any of them could process. Clint shifted his weight, and the mobster with the gun barely had time to register the movement before Clint had turned, grabbing his wrist in a vice grip. The gun went flying out of his hand, landing with a clatter on the wet pavement. The mobster yelped in pain, his knees buckling beneath him as Clint shoved him aside. The other men looked on, frozen. Their leader was still trapped by Clint's iron grip, unable to escape, his face twisted in fear and humiliation. "Get him off me," the leader shouted, but there was no power in his voice now, only weakness. Clint's grip tightened once more, and the mobster gasped. "You want to play? You want to keep pushing me?" Clint said, his voice low, steady. "I don't play games. I end them." A sharp cry echoed from the alley as one of the other mobsters lunged at Clint, a knife in hand, but Clint was faster. He pivoted, ducking under the man's wild slash, and in one smooth motion, Clint disarmed him, sending the knife flying into the gutter. "You're all out of your league," Clint said, his voice now sharp, cutting through the rain, each word carrying the weight of a man who had lived through it all. The mobsters were backing off now, their bravado gone. They had underestimated Clint, thinking he was just an old man, just some out-of-place figure who didn't belong in their world. But they were learning. Too late. The leader's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling in panic as Clint pulled him away from the wall, his grip unyielding. "What are you going to do now?" Clint asked, his voice the final nail in the coffin. The leader didn't answer, and Clint didn't expect him to. The rest of the mob was gone, retreating into the shadows, but Clint remained, standing tall in the rain, the woman still cowering behind him. Clint's presence in the alley was undeniable. He stood like a rock, unmoving and solid in the storm, his face hardened and unreadable. The leader of the mob, now physically restrained by Clint, was still gasping for breath. He had been caught in the trap he set for himself, and there was no escaping it. The power he once held, the illusion of control, was shattered. Clint wasn't just some old man. He was something much more, and the other men in the mob had realized it too. "Let me go," the leader croaked, his voice now weak, filled with desperation. His body trembled slightly, the gunshots from earlier still ringing in his ears. He had been humiliated, outmaneuvered, and overpowered in a way that no one had ever done to him before. The others, his men, had backed off, afraid, confused, and ashamed. They didn't know how to handle this. They weren't prepared for someone like Clint. Clint's grip tightened on the leader's collar, his knuckles white as he shoved the man back against the wall. He leaned in, his voice a low growl that seemed to come from deep within him. "You don't get to call the shots anymore." The leader's eyes darted around, looking for someone to help him, but the other men were too far gone. They had seen Clint's power firsthand. They had seen how quickly he had disarmed one of their own, how effortlessly he had taken control of the situation. There was no savior coming to help. The leader was on his own. "I'm not gonna beg," the leader sneered, though it was clear that he was no longer certain of that. His pride, which had been his strongest weapon, was crumbling with each passing second. "You think you've won? You think you've beaten me? I'm just one man. You don't know what you've started." Clint's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He leaned in closer, his breath just inches from the leader's ear. "I know exactly what I've started," he said, his voice steady and calm, like a man who had been through it all and knew exactly how to end it. "And it ends now." The leader shuddered. His mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan, but all he could come up with was desperation. Desperation to regain control, to escape, to reverse the situation. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Clint shoved him back hard against the wall, knocking the wind out of him. Clint didn't say anything this time. His silence was more deafening than any words could have been. It wasn't about speeches or threats. It was about the power Clint exuded, the overwhelming, undeniable force that he had become in this moment. The mobsters behind the leader shrank further into the shadows, unwilling to step forward. The fear in their eyes was impossible to hide now. "You've done enough damage," Clint said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the leader. "And now it's time for you to pay." The words didn't need to be loud to carry weight. The rain continued to fall, but it didn't matter. The world outside this alley had faded into nothing, leaving only Clint and the remnants of the mob. The leader's face twisted with rage and frustration, but it was a helpless rage. He had no control, no way of fighting back. Clint was too far gone, too far ahead of him in every sense. There was no escape now. Clint didn't wait for the leader to speak or to make any more empty threats. He knew the man had nothing left. He wasn't interested in words anymore. He was interested in finishing this, in putting an end to the violence and cruelty that had brought them to this point. As Clint's hand tightened once again, the leader began to falter, his body trembling not from the physical grip, but from the realization that his end was coming. The other mobsters could do nothing but watch, their eyes darting nervously between Clint and their leader, too scared to act, too lost in their own fear to step forward. In that moment, the woman behind Clint, still trembling and broken from the abuse she had endured, finally spoke. Her voice was faint but steady. "It's over. You don't have to do this." Clint's gaze softened, just for a moment, as he turned to face her. His eyes locked with hers, and for the briefest of moments, the world seemed to pause. She had been through hell, but she was still standing, still holding onto the faintest glimmer of hope. And that was enough. "I'm not doing this for me," Clint said, his voice steady. "I'm doing this for people like you, for people who don't have a voice, for people who are too scared to fight back." The words hung in the air between them, powerful and undeniable. The mobsters in the alley, frozen by Clint's intensity, couldn't say a word. They had nothing left to say. The leader's breathing had grown erratic, his face pale as Clint's grip remained unyielding. He had finally realized that he wasn't going to escape this. The nightmare had become his reality, and now he was trapped. Clint didn't wait for the leader to beg or plead for mercy. There was no mercy to be had. Not today. Not after everything that had been done. It was clear now. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning. Time seemed to slow as Clint's unyielding grip on the man tightened. His eyes cold, calculating, showing no mercy. The leader, once so full of confidence, now stood vulnerable, his face contorted in a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. His eyes flickered between Clint's unwavering gaze and the shadows, where his men had retreated. The power he once held, his stronghold, his reign over fear, had crumbled. There was nothing left for him to do but stand there, trapped in Clint's unrelenting grasp. "You really thought you could control this, didn't you?" Clint's voice broke through the heavy silence, his words cutting through the storm like a knife. "You thought your men, your guns, your threats would make a difference. But you were wrong." The leader's chest heaved, his breath ragged as he tried to collect himself. But the fear in his eyes was undeniable. There was no fighting this anymore. He had lost. The other mobsters, still in the shadows, exchanged uneasy glances. They were no longer confident. They weren't even sure who to follow anymore. Their leader, the one who had led them for years, was now reduced to a helpless figure, his hands trembling under Clint's grip. They had never seen him like this before, broken, frightened, defeated, and it unnerved them. Clint's gaze shifted slightly, catching the eye of one of the other mobsters, a younger man who had been standing off to the side, unsure of what to do. The man's eyes darted nervously between Clint and the leader, then back to the group, and Clint saw it: fear. Fear that this whole world he had been part of was crumbling. Clint could see the internal battle in the man's eyes, torn between the loyalty he had once felt for the leader and the realization that following him now would only lead to destruction. Clint gave the man a single nod, acknowledging the internal conflict that was playing out in front of him. The man shifted uneasily, his fingers twitching as he eyed the gun in his holster. He had no idea what to do, but in Clint's presence, he knew better than to make a move without thinking. There was no telling what would happen next. "You think I'm afraid of you?" The leader spat, his voice trembling. "I've been through worse. You won't scare me. You won't win." Clint's expression remained unchanged. "You're not scared of me," Clint replied, his tone cold and firm, "but you should be scared of what comes next. This ends now. You've terrorized people long enough." The mobster with the gun, the one Clint had locked eyes with, shifted uncomfortably again, his hand hovering over his weapon. Clint saw this and took a single step toward him, his movement deliberate and calm. It was a warning not to make a rash decision. The leader's eyes flicked to the man with the gun, and for a moment, Clint could see the fear creeping into his expression. This was the moment, the breaking point, the realization that they weren't in control anymore. "I don't need you anymore," the leader hissed, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. He was still grasping at the threads of his power, trying to convince himself that he had a way out, but Clint wasn't buying it. Without warning, Clint spun the leader around, slamming his back into the wall with a thud that echoed down the alley. The force of the impact left the leader gasping for air, unable to do anything but struggle. Clint's eyes bore into him, unmoving, unwavering. "You don't understand," Clint said quietly. "This isn't about you anymore. It's about what you've done to others. It's about the lives you've ruined." The leader's face twisted in a final, desperate sneer, but it didn't fool Clint. He could see the fear now, not just in the man's eyes but in the way his body trembled. It wasn't just physical weakness anymore. It was the collapse of everything the leader had built, his empire, his power, his control over the mob. It was all coming undone, and Clint was the catalyst. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" The leader spat, but the defiance was hollow now, empty. There was nothing left for him to fight for. Clint didn't respond. Instead, he let the silence drag on, each second stretching longer than the last. He wanted the leader to feel it. He wanted him to feel the weight of the consequences of his actions, the finality of the moment. And then, as if the weight of the world had finally been placed on the leader's shoulders, he broke. His body slumped against the wall, his head hanging low in surrender. The fight had left him. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. Clint stepped back slowly, releasing his grip on the leader. The man crumpled to the ground, his knees hitting the wet pavement with a soft thud. The mobsters who had once followed him stood silently, unsure of what to do next. They had watched their leader crumble, and with that, they realized just how powerless they had become. The alley was silent again, save for the sound of rain and the distant hum of the city. Clint stood, unwavering, as the mobsters finally began to realize the truth. This was over. The reign of terror they had imposed on the streets had come to an end, and Clint had been the one to end it. The woman who had been cowering behind Clint stepped forward, her eyes wide, her body trembling but her spirit beginning to lift. She had witnessed the entire confrontation, the rise and fall of the man who had caused so much pain. And now she was free. Clint turned to face her, his expression softening ever so slightly. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a glimmer of hope. But even as Clint stood there, victorious in a sense, he knew this wasn't over. This wasn't the end. There was more to be done. The consequences of this night would stretch far beyond this alley, and Clint was ready for whatever came next. The woman, standing off to the side, her clothes tattered and drenched, was the only one not visibly shaken by the storm. She watched Clint, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and fear. The brutal confrontation had left its mark on her as much as it had on the mobsters. Yet there was a quiet, simmering power in her gaze, an unspoken understanding of what had happened. The battle was not over, not yet. Clint stood tall, unmoving, his focus unwavering as he watched the leader of the mob, now kneeling in the muck. The man's body trembled, but his eyes were no longer filled with anger or defiance. There was no fight left in him. And yet, Clint knew this moment wasn't just about the leader. It was about everyone who had been touched by this violence, this cruelty. The power to stop it, to end it, had always been within Clint's grasp. He stepped back, slowly, but his eyes never left the fallen leader. The rain soaked his worn jacket, but he barely seemed to notice. The woman could feel the tension rising in her chest, as if the very world around them was holding its breath. The silence, broken only by the soft tapping of rain against the pavement, seemed to stretch endlessly. Then one of the other mobsters spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're done. This is over, right?" It wasn't the question itself, but the tone, defeat. The man wasn't asking for permission. He was seeking affirmation. There was no fight left in him either. He had seen the strength in Clint, felt the crushing weight of his resolve. The other mobsters shifted uneasily, looking to each other, unsure whether to make a move or stay silent. The leader, his voice hoarse, raised his head slightly. He met Clint's gaze, and for the first time, Clint saw fear. Not just fear of physical defeat, but something deeper, something far more unsettling. A fear of having lost control over the empire he had built, a fear of what would happen now that his reign was over. Clint took another step back, his jaw clenched. "You've terrorized this city long enough. But you're done. All of you." The mobsters flinched as his words hit home. The leader's face twisted in rage, but it was weak now. His power was shattered, his men no longer looking to him for guidance. The silence was deafening, suffocating in its intensity. Then, a voice broke through the tension. "I didn't want this," the woman said, her voice trembling but strong. "I didn't want any of this." Her words echoed in the alley, and for the first time, the mobsters shifted uncomfortably. Their eyes flicked to her, then back to Clint. It was as if they had forgotten she was there, too lost in their own survival to acknowledge her suffering. But now, with the violence dying down and the moment hanging on the edge of a knife, they saw her for the first time. Clint's eyes softened ever so slightly as he turned to her. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond forged through shared struggle. She had endured unimaginable pain, and now she had survived. Clint had fought for her, but more than that, he had fought for something deeper. He had fought for the humanity that still existed in this broken world. "Then this is over," Clint said quietly, his gaze never leaving the mob. "No more bloodshed, no violence. You have no power here anymore." The leader's eyes burned with one final flicker of defiance. But it was clear. The fight was gone from him. His shoulders slumped, his posture breaking under the weight of Clint's words. Slowly, he lowered his head, and the tension in the alley seemed to dissipate, leaving nothing but the sound of the rain, now falling softer. Clint turned his back to the mobsters, a quiet dismissal. It was over. This wasn't a victory born of brute force. It wasn't about the physicality of the fight. It was about something deeper, something that Clint had learned long ago. In the end, it wasn't the violence that won. It was the will to stand tall in the face of it, to endure when everything else seemed to collapse. The woman stepped forward now, her body still trembling but her eyes stronger than before. She reached out, her hand finding Clint's arm, and for a moment, the alley seemed less cold, less hostile. She wasn't alone anymore. No one was. And though Clint's expression remained stoic, his heart, hidden beneath the hardened exterior, finally softened. The woman had survived, and with her, so had the world that had once felt so hopeless. The mob was broken, their power shattered, their fear real. Clint had done more than stand tall against the storm. He had ended it. The rain, once a heavy torrent, had dwindled to a mere drizzle, its soft pitter-patter now a distant memory against the backdrop of broken silence. Clint's eyes remained locked on the fallen mobsters, their faces now marked with defeat. The once mighty group, capable of instilling terror, were now like shadows in the rain, nothing more than men with nothing left to prove. The leader, hunched on the ground, could barely lift his head. His hands were trembling, not just from the physical strain but from the deep realization that everything he had fought for was gone. His empire of fear had crumbled, destroyed by a single man who had seen through his facade. Clint stood there, unmoving, his back to the world, his face still and stoic as always. You don't get it," the leader rasped, his voice hoarse from the fear and helplessness that had overwhelmed him. He tried to rise, his body aching from Clint's grip, but his strength had long left him. "You think this is the end? That we're finished? You can't just take us down like this." Clint didn't respond. There was no need for words now. The silence spoke volumes. His stance, strong and silent, told the story. The leader's rant faded into nothing as he saw no reaction from Clint. No movement that would indicate his words had any weight. This was it. There was no fight left in him. Behind Clint, the woman still stood, her form silhouetted against the dim light, a stark contrast to the men who now crouched in fear before him. The courage she had shown throughout this ordeal now reflected in her eyes. She had witnessed everything, the violence, the terror, the power plays, and now she was free. They were free, and yet, Clint knew that her fight wasn't over. She had been pushed to the edge of survival, and it was time for her to rebuild, to find her place in the world again. Turning his back to the mob, Clint slowly walked toward the woman. The rain was still falling lightly, but its presence no longer felt cold or oppressive. There was a warmth in the way Clint walked, his presence a shield that seemed to absorb the chaos and leave only peace in its wake. As he reached her, he paused for a moment, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "It's over now," he said softly, his voice carrying an unspoken promise. He didn't need to say more. The weight of the moment spoke for him. The woman turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also something else. Something Clint had seen in the eyes of many before her. A flicker of pain, of loss, and yet a quiet determination to keep moving forward. She nodded, as if hearing those words for the first time in a long time. The fear, the uncertainty, the chaos, it was all finally starting to recede. The mob was finished, and with them, the oppression they had instilled in the streets. Clint looked back over his shoulder. The mobsters were still sitting in the rain, their heads hung low, their bodies broken. There was no victory to be had here, no triumph in seeing them defeated. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had been able to put an end to their terror, that this world, for all its violence, had a chance to breathe again. The woman's voice broke the silence. "What happens now?" Clint looked at her, his gaze steady. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. The words were weighty, but they were the truth. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars of what had happened would linger, but they would heal. They would have to. From behind Clint, a few of the remaining mobsters, those too scared to act, started to rise, their movements hesitant. They glanced nervously at Clint, unsure of what to do next. One of them, the man Clint had locked eyes with earlier, took a step forward, his body still trembling but his resolve slowly returning. He was no longer the man who had followed the leader's every command. There was something different in him now, a flicker of doubt, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to live. Clint turned slightly, his gaze sharp as he regarded the man. The mobster froze, his eyes widening, his fear returning in an instant. Clint didn't move toward him, but his mere presence was enough to send the man back into the shadows, where he belonged. There would be no mercy here, not yet. The healing would take time, but it would happen. And it was in Clint's quiet, unyielding power that the change would begin. "You won't be seeing these streets the same way again," Clint said to the mobsters, his voice steady, unwavering. He didn't need to say more. The reality of their situation was clear. Turning back to the woman, Clint gave her a final nod. "You'll be all right," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had seen both the worst and the best of the world. There was no more to say. As Clint walked away, the rain began to subside, leaving behind a stillness that had never been there before. The street was quieter, the weight of the violence lifted, at least for now. The woman stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. This wasn't the end of her journey, but it was the beginning of something new, and that was enough.